It's the week ending Saturday the 1st of July, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen 6 people charged with offences relating to the Hillsborough disaster, President Trump's travel ban partially restored, and every single tower block tested for flammable material come back positive. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. The news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Arion McNicoll. Let's unwrap the week. Olly Mann, it seems, is unable to book a short holiday, and so it's left to me once again to welcome my colleagues from the week's digital team. They are Jamie Timson and Elizabeth Carr-Ellis, and returning from the week junior, we have Felicity Capon. Hello, everyone. And to start the show this week, it's Jamie. Jamie, what will this week be remembered for?
Are we going back to a different kind of identity politics?
Britain had ID cards during the Second World War. Winston Churchill scrapped them because they weren't needed anymore. Now Gordon Brown wants to bring all that back. It might be worth it, some might say, if it stopped terrorism. But it won't. The terrorists who bombed the main station in Madrid all had valid Spanish ID cards. The 9/11 bombers had valid papers too.
That was Nick Clegg talking ID cards to the soundtrack of Now That's What I Call Ibiza 2008. It was taken from the political slot on Channel 4 in that very same year. Jamie, 7 years after Theresa May scrapped ID cards, which was her very first announcement when she entered the Home Office, they're back on the agenda. Why is that?
This week, it seems that having to sign up and put your biometric data into a big database when the rest of the country doesn't may prove a bit of a stumbling block in terms of Brexit negotiations. Claude Moraes, who was chairman of the European Parliament's Civil Liberties Committee, said that anything that leaves EU citizens as a second class will be seen as a stumbling block. Therefore, it's not unfeasible in my mind to imagine that this is a identity cards by the back door. Eventually, we'll end up in a situation where every person will have to sign up for an ID card.
Okay, well, let's go into what the problem with identity cards would be in any case. Elizabeth, you've lived in Spain. Continental Europe has identity cards in many places. So what's it like and why is it a problem?
It's not a problem at all. We had ID cards when we first moved to Spain. We had to register after, I think it's 6 months you're allowed to live in the country before you have to register, which we did. You get your ID cards. Everybody has to carry an ID card. Spanish, American, Australian, everybody in Spain carries an ID card, and it's just accepted. You do it. It was my picture, my national insurance number as it was over there, my thumbprint on the back, and that was it.
And you had no problem with it?
We had no problem. The problem came when the EU ruled that ID cards could not be enforced on people who didn't have them in their own country. So then Spain turned around and says, well, fine, we're not giving you any more ID cards, which meant simple things like paying by card. You always have to flash your ID card when you pay by card in a shop. We couldn't do that anymore because we didn't have an ID card.
Okay, so this is the problem, presumably, that people who object to ID cards are concerned about. If they do become mandatory issue, you'll be limited in the things you can do, not only, say, purchases that you're describing, but voting or, leaving the country. This is the concern, right, Jamie?
Yeah, I mean, in their manifesto, this election, they wanted to bring in identification for voting, which would seem to curtail the idea of the majority of people being able to vote freely. If you're saying you have to carry some form of identification in order to be able to vote, a lot of people that have to go through the process, perhaps for expense reasons or even just because they're not aware that this is something that people need to do, will end up being disenfranchised.
But EU citizens are disenfranchised anyway. I wasn't allowed to vote in Spain.
That doesn't make it okay, though.
No, but I wasn't allowed to vote in Spain.
But that's what I'm saying. But that's not
system.
okay. Like, what I want is enfranchising for everyone, and I think anything that curtails that and puts a block on it, which I'm certain that identity cards will be used if they are rolled out, it will be used to say, okay, so these people, they don't have passports because they can't afford it or whatever, but we're going to force them to have identity cards, and now we're looking at a system where society is being already structured into different tiers or levels of citizens. I think it's a worry.
And I think it's also relevant that one of the strongest opponents of ID cards back in the day was David Davis, who is now seems to be its biggest cheerleader. And I think the sheer hypocrisy of that for someone who, was very much in favour of civil liberties is something that has to be questioned. He sort of says it's not an ID card, and then he says it's a document of identification or something. That all seems
With
a bit...
picture.
Yeah, it all seems
Humphrey would be so proud.
slightly ridiculous. And also the concerns that he had raised in the past, the so-called honeypot problem, the fact that these cards can attract criminals and hackers.
Yeah. I
mean, in the hands of the Home Office, does anyone trust the Home Office to be able to look after these cards? You just see all the cyber attacks of the NHS. I mean, I don't feel comfortable.
If you're protecting
about that
things with Windows 95, as it's been proven to be shown, what we don't want is a huge database of people's biometric details.
But what do you think is contained in your NI number, which is all on a
It's not got my
database?
fingerprint or my iris.
Mine didn't have my iris on anyway.
But that's what I mean. But identity cards will at some point have. I mean, it's certain to have your fingerprint on it and your iris. I think it's a worry for us to start compiling huge databases that are hugely valuable to hackers and anyone that wants to cause problems.
But in the wake of the Investigatory Powers Act, surely ID cards are only a physical manifestation of a broader problem or a broader issue, which is how much information the government has on each of us. And surely that bird has already flown, right?
But that doesn't mean that you don't fight it every step. I think the idea is just because we're living in a country now where people are being surveilled, thin end of the wedge is obviously a problem.
But I don't understand the argument. If you're happy to give Samsung and Apple your fingerprint and your iris to open your phone, then why not put them into the government?
I think that's a false argument in a way, because the problem is that I'm not happy with the government having it, but if you choose to give Apple or whoever your fingerprint, then that's down to you. But what's happening is that the government is forcing people to. It's no longer a choice when you say you've got to have an ID card, you've got to put your thumb down, whereas people who don't want to give their thumbprints to Apple could just not buy the phone.
You're holding an Apple phone there, Jamie. To what extent are we actually able to make this choice?
I mean, yeah, totally. I'm as hypocritical as the rest of them. I'm sure that I give away much more personal information than anyone, or as much as anyone else. But I think the key issue is that it is my choice.
So coming back to your point, Felicity, why has David Davis changed his view on this? And do we think that this is the government trying to sneak through ID cards again via something to do with Brexit? Or is it unconnected?
I think it certainly seems like they are trying to sneak it through. I think David Davis is in a very awkward position, though, based on his previous engagement with this issue. But I think what is more concerning probably, and what the EU is saying, is how on earth is this going to work? And I think they want questions for more transparency, and I think a lot of people do. The whole 5 years continuous residence, and then you get settled status. Well, I mean, how continuous is continuous? How do you prove that you have been in this country 5 years continuously? What happens if you've been in and out of the country, that sort of thing? And how do you prove it if you've been doing temporary work, picking strawberries in East Anglia somewhere? I think these are the issues that I think there's just no one really kind of knows what's going on, and I find that more troubling, I think.
I think that's the problem we're all having, that it's such early days in terms of the Brexit negotiations. We're not entirely certain where it's going to go. But do we think that what we're going to end up with is this two-tier system where non-Brits will have certain rules that apply to them and Brits will have a different set?
No, because I think that goes very against hated phrase, British values. We are a fair country. You just have to look at the last general election when Labour got a huge upswing of people who are happy to pay more to make this society more fair. So I don't think that would happen.
I think that the only way they can get around the idea of a two-tier system is to make everyone have identity cards, because it will be the identity card that distinguishes between the two. So I think that what we'll end up having is a system where everyone carries identity cards all the time, and I'll be angrier.
Okay, well, we'll just have to wait and see and linger on your anger, Jamie. I'm sure you'll have application for it for the next couple of years. Next up, it's Felicity. What will this week be remembered for?
The return of a contentious issue once again.
A third of women in the UK will receive an abortion in their lifetimes, making it one of the most common gynecological procedures. Yet we insist on regulating this with a legal framework rooted in the conservative values of the Victorian era. Granted, the Abortion Act is only 50, but this did not and does not go far enough to liberate women from patriarchal and traditionalist law. The Abortion Act hands over the power of decision-making over your reproductive rights to 2 doctors from the woman. In 1960s Britain, this was the norm for many medical decisions that we now see as self-evidently belonging to the patient. I could make a decision to receive cosmetic surgery, to refuse a blood transfusion, but I do not have the right to decide whether it is in my best interest to have an abortion.
That was Dr. Megan Brown speaking this week at a debate organised by the British Medical Association. Felicity, the BMA on Wednesday voted in favour of decriminalising abortion. Do you think that this is a kind of turning point in abortion rights in this country?
Yeah, I think quite possibly. You have to remember that the BMA, Professional Organisation and Trade Union for Doctors, is a very powerful organisation, and they do have the power to lobby MPs for legislation, and already there seems to be a lot of cross-party support for a change in the law. So I think it is very significant that they have voted in favour of decriminalisation. And I also think it's significant how heated the debate actually was. It's obviously a very emotive and divisive issue, but I think what it kind of comes down to is the idea that one of the laws governing this area is pretty archaic. We're talking about the Offences Against the Person Act 1861, which was before women could even vote. So I think people find that pretty extraordinary that is still relevant in today's law.
And then how was that law affected by the 1967 Abortion Act? How did that change things?
So what decriminalisation would mean is that instead of abortion being a crime for which there are exceptions, it would change to abortion would be lawful, but there would be some exceptions. So 50 years ago, the Abortion Act of 1967 came into law, and that provided exceptions. So abortion remains illegal unless you fulfill the requirements of the 1967 law, which is having 2 doctors who ensure that the requirements are fulfilled, that they sign a relevant certificate, and that it can go ahead.
I mean, I think a lot of people would find that surprising, that abortion isn't just totally legal in this country. The practical reality is that it is possible to get abortions. These days, prosecutions for having an abortion are really quite rare. So how would changing the law change matters, and why is it important?
Prosecutions are rare, but they're not unheard of. And certainly within the past few years, there have been a handful of cases of women going to prison under this 1861 law. So, I mean, I agree that it's not, I think a third of women in their lifetimes will have abortion. In 2014, 1 in 5 pregnancies ended abortion. We're obviously not saying that all these women are going to be prosecuted. That doesn't happen. And it is sort of readily available. Lots of women do have them. But I think it's the stigma attached, the kind of, you're saying this is a crime, and I think that's dangerous for both women, especially vulnerable women who are being told what you're doing is criminal, and also for doctors who might find that very difficult, even though they can conscientiously object. I think it must be still place a burden to know that what you're doing has a kind of criminal element to it.
Elizabeth, what's your thought? Does the law need to be changed?
Yes, very much so. I find it quite abhorrent that she has to go to a doctor to get permission to do something that is a very personal and a very hard thought out decision. I was reading The Telegraph about this yesterday, and they actually had a poll asking whether it should be decriminalised. 55% were against it because they said it could put vulnerable women at risk. This is what I find most interesting about this argument, is it comes up with an idea of what womanhood is and what women should be, and is trying to impose a law around that idea.
I think there are very strong reasons why it shouldn't be decriminalised. And I think it's not a case of pro-life versus pro-choice. And I think you get a lot of feminists on either side, and you get a lot of everyone on every side, really. But I think there are concerns that if you decriminalise it, you could see more unqualified individuals and vulnerable women who could administer both surgical and medical abortions themselves without having a conversation with professionals about the choice they're about to make. So I think at the moment, the fact that you do have to speak to 2 people who will ask you why you want to do this, who could hopefully rule out the possibility that you're being coerced into it or it's an impulsive decision, I think some people say that's extremely important, that you still have that, and you don't just get some pills and do it yourself.
I think there's a kind of, like, there must be a happy medium between these 2 areas, because I think that what you could say is that you could decriminalise it, but make sure that it was regulated in a way, and have things like a lot of maternity care is done through nurses and midwives and things like that. And at the moment, they have nothing to do with, you can't have anything to do with an abortion because it has to be done through doctors. Yeah. And actually, there are lots of skilled people that aren't doctors that could work with people in situations. And it doesn't even have to be, as you said, it's not pro-life or pro-choice, but there is a way that you could decriminalise it. And to take it back to Elizabeth's hated phrase, there is an idea of British values and what kind of country we want to project. And I think decriminalising something and not attaching a stigma, as you said, is actually really important.
And I'd also just like to add that the BMA are very clear that by decriminalising it in its entirety, it would still be heavily regulated, and that also they still very much support the 24 time limit. So that wouldn't change.
One of the other speakers at that BMA conference raised another point, saying that countries where abortion has been decriminalised have seen quite significant rises in sex-selective abortions where people have terminated based on the fact that they usually want a boy rather than a girl. Is that a concern and something that needs to be thought about?
I mean, yes, to a certain extent. I think there are other concerns. I don't feel any woman really takes this decision lightly, and I think it's a very difficult and traumatic decision to make. And I think what gets people more is the fact that it is archaic and outdated and has this criminal sanction attached to it. And I think with keeping the regulation in place, I think that's kind of the more pertinent.
I think also it's the thing that goes back to a kind of broader point, is that you don't legislate for the few. So there's few people that are perhaps going to be doing something that you perhaps think is morally unjust or whatever. You don't create laws based on the fact that some people are going to create crimes. What you do is create laws that allow people, the majority of people, to do what you believe is right.
Oh, well, watch this space. Last up, it's Elizabeth. What will this week be remembered for?
It appears that culture doesn't stop at the Watford Gap.
Our intention is to provide and to support great art for everyone, and we recognise that in order to do that we've got to work with more people in more places and get more money across the country so that can be done in the very best possible way.
That was Rebecca Blackman, Senior Manager at Arts Council England in the West Midlands, talking to the BBC. Elizabeth, this was the week that the Arts Council funding was divvied up between museums, theatres and artists, with more money actually being spent on the regions of England at the expense of London. Is it enough?
No, it's not. I would argue against the phrase at the expense of London, because London is still receiving 40% of Arts Council England's funding, which is still a fair chunk. The reason I found this extremely interesting this week is Hull has just put out its findings after its first 6 months of being the UK's City of Culture. And it has been an absolutely amazing success, not only in terms of numbers going to see the exhibitions, the theatre, the art shows, but also in terms of raising revenue for the city, which is why I think the Arts Council should be given more to the regions and taken from London.
So we have Hull being the UK capital of culture, we've got the Manchester International Festival, let's not forget Glastonbury and other events that are held outside of London. This is hardly the death of culture we're seeing external to London.
It's not, but we have situations where Hull, for example, raised 32 million for its entire year of festival. The National Theatre is complaining because it's lost £500,000 of its funding. Its funding is from next year will be £16.7 million. That's half of what Hull, an entire city, got for its entire year of festivals. That's not fair. How many people are going to go to the National Theatre compared to the hundreds of thousands who have so far been to see Hull? One of the installations at Hull has had nearly 500,000 people go to it to go see a rotor blade. It's a fantastic rotor blade, but it's not something that really grabs the imagination. Yet 500,000 people have gone to see it. The National Theatre, I think, is going to have to fight that a bit.
I mean, isn't the problem more broadly that arts funding is insufficient on a national level rather than let's all fight over the scraps that there are?
How many people were that went to see the rotor blade coming up from London on the train, though? Just saying.
Went to see the rotor blade leaving London, that is. Yes.
I mean, yeah, is the problem that there's not enough money in arts funding in general?
I think that throughout time, well, not throughout time. From
Since
the beginnings
dawn of the earth.
No, certainly recently there's been a real dearth of people putting money into the arts and really believing that culture is something that can be cut and cut and cut and cut without any real natural effect. You know, people aren't dying because they haven't got enough culture. But actually, I think that if you think back to the things that people really do talk about and remember, I mean, I hate to go on about the Olympics, but that opening ceremony, I think, seems to be like the best thing that's ever happened to Britain in the past 10 years.
5 years ago, Jamie.
Yeah,
let
I
it
know,
go.
but that's the thing, is that people still reference it all the time. And what was that? That was culture. That was actual culture organised by Danny Boyle.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, for every pound that's put into the arts, that's put into culture, we get £7 back into the economy.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? That there's an economic argument that can be made for culture. It is something that generates profits. Is this a reason to increase funding to the UK City of Culture project?
Yes, it is. Cities are now fighting to be the next City of Culture. It's a 4-yearly thing. They're already putting in their bids. And it's getting quite fierce. You have Paisley against Perth up in Scotland, and they're both very angry that the other one is trying to get their money, basically, because it's just going to have such a huge impact. Hull, for example, 17% use the trains more in Hull in January because of the City of Culture. Hull, I love you, Hull. You're not the nicest place to go in January. I'd rather be down in the Canary Islands.
We've just lost all our Hull listeners.
As a place to go in January, it's not usually on people's hit list. This shows that there is a huge demand.
I feel like there's a wider point to be made about London versus the rest of the country, though. You know, this country is unusually centralised in the fact that London kind of sucks in all the investment and talent from the rest of the country with really disastrous consequences, I would say. I would take it out of the cultural context and say that in terms of politics, I think you should see Parliament moving to Manchester, or, you've just had the Supreme Court who've sat in Edinburgh for the first time ever so that ordinary people can observe the workings of the court. And I think it's things like that would do so much more. And I think you only have to look at Brexit to see that I think there is still a very much a north-south divide, and people looking at London and saying, you're just in your little elite bubble and you just do your little London thing, and what about the rest of us? I was watching the news last night about Hillsborough and the incredible campaign for justice, which has taken 30 years, and someone on the news was saying that, it's Liverpool's raised profile, it's growing self-confidence, it's kind of renaissance, it's improved economic prospects. That means that Liverpool has felt that it can really fight for justice in this case. So in a way, it kind of affects everything. The status of a city or a town can impinge on so much more than culture.
I don't often agree with George Osborne. Rarely. But I do think that the Northern Powerhouse's idea, at least, was something that needed to be... I mean, he didn't do it very well, but I think there was certainly something in it, because I think what we need is... It's shocking, the rail links in the north of the country. It's absolutely shocking that the only way that you can get good rail is if you attach it to London. It's mad that we accept the fact that up north you can't get a bus. The bus travel between towns is 1 an hour, 1 every 2 hours. It's these things have all just become accepted in this country, despite the fact that I don't know how many people live outside of London, but much more than live in London. Wait, I'll do the math. 64, 50,
85% of the population.
85% of the population. There you go.
You didn't do those maths at all. You just waited until Elizabeth did those maths.
85% of England's population lives outside.
And it's accepted because all of our news comes from London. All of our business is there.
That's started to change with the BBC moving some operations up to Manchester.
That didn't really work, though, did it? You had a lot of journalists who just said, no, I'm not leaving London. I think they thought we didn't even have knives and forks in the north, to be honest.
Right, but so would we see that problem if you tried to take other apparatus?
Well, that's what they're so afraid of Parliament, aren't they? They're absolutely terrified about me having to move Parliament outside of London.
But why? I don't understand. Is it just because a load of old fogies who can't possibly bear to leave the grandiose...
I guess so. I guess so. But they're just... Because I think move Parliament to Manchester. Actually, move our capital to Manchester and see what happens. Just because London will still be London.
The Arts Council shows there is a huge wealth of culture around England and, you know, Arts Council Scotland, Edinburgh, you have the festivals coming up, which is an amazing event. But there's still this idea that if it's not in London, it's not good. So the Arts Council should be developing more. I say cut London's funding even more. We have millions of tourists come here every year that fetch money to the city. We could transfer that to other cities.
So you're talking about cities in particular, but funding very rarely makes it to villages and towns and so on. Is that something that we need to see increase as well?
Definitely. Where I live, we have this beautiful little town called Hexham, which people have to travel into Newcastle from, which is about a 40-minute drive. If they want to go see something good, something big at a theatre, they have to go there. So yeah, definitely, our little towns and villages desperately need funding. It's something that brings a community together. Going back to Jamie's point about the London Olympics, the whole country felt as one for that. So it's a way of fetching a whole region together.
I think that we shouldn't cut funding at all. So I probably slightly disagree with Elizabeth that we should cut. I just think we should, you know, stick up corporation tax and give all the money to culture and arts, you know. But I do agree that certainly we need to maybe look at areas other than big metro areas and towns.
I will wave the red flag with you on that one, definitely. But I also think we have to stop thinking of culture as some airy-fairy thing. It gives a lot back to the nation. It gives a lot back to the economy. You never hear politicians saying, oh, we're going to put more theatres into the cities or into the regions because they fetch so much back to the economy in the way that they would do for an industry, for example.
Well, look, we can do our bit to support this cause by devolving this podcast to Hexham. That's it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Jamie Timson, Felicity Capon and Elizabeth Carr-Ellis. For more from The Week, why not visit theweek.co.uk, download our free iPhone app, The Weekday, or get the magazine direct to your door. Just head to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. And you can find this podcast everywhere, literally everywhere, provided that it does podcasts, that is. Just search for The Week Unwrapped. I've been Arion McNicoll. Our music is by Tom Morby. The producer is Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, goodbye.